At dawn in Cairo, a fevered English earl lies sweating in a hotel room, his shaving cut stinging like fire. For months, he has chased one boy king through desert dust and newspaper noise, and now his breath begins to fail, but the story refuses to stay in Egypt. In Hampshire, a great house called Highclere still holds last night's smoke in its tapestries and last season's debts in its ledgers. When the Earl dies on the 5th of April, 1923, the city lights reportedly flicker and a dog at home is said to collapse. Coincidence or a price collected, the marriage that bought a castle? She arrived as a young bride, but the first thing she truly inherited was a ledger full of dread. Highclere Castle rises from Hampshire soil like something conjured from ambition and stone. Its towers pierce the English sky with Victorian confidence. The library holds leather volumes no one reads anymore. The drawing rooms glow with chandeliers that cost a year of tenant rents. But in 1895, when the 5th Earl of Carnarvon brought his young bride home, the most honest thing in that castle was a stack of bills. The late 19th century was brilliant at producing beauty and terrible at paying for it. Grand estates like Highclere operated on a simple principle. Land generated income, income supported splendor, and splendor confirmed your place in the world. Except the land was failing. Agricultural depression had strangled rents. American grain flooded British markets. Tenant farmers could not pay what they owed, and landlords could not collect what they needed. The aristocracy smiled at dinners and sweated over bank statements. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, understood this better than most. He had inherited Highclere at 24, along with its history and its hunger. The castle demanded everything. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, staff needed wages. Entertaining required excess. The estate ate money faster than tenants could produce it. So he did what many desperate men in his position did. He married a fortune. Her name was Almina Victoria Maria Alexandra Womwell, though the world would know her as Lady Carnarvon. She was 19 when they wed, beautiful, poised, educated in Paris, fluent in the manners that mattered. But the whispers followed her like perfume. Everyone knew where the money came from, even if no one said it plainly in polite company. In Alfred de Rothschild, the banking magnate had no legitimate children, but he had raised Almina as his goddaughter, showered her with affection, and most importantly, settled a fortune on her that made her one of the wealthiest young women in England. The rumor was simple. She was his daughter. The evidence was circumstantial but persuasive. The money was undeniable. Carnarvon needed what Rothschild could provide. Almina needed what the title could grant. It was a transaction dressed in orange blossoms and hymns. The wedding took place in June 1895. The settlements were generous. Rothschild money flowed into Carnarvon coffers. Highclere's immediate debts vanished. Renovations began. The castle breathed again. But every rescue comes with terms. Almina had bought her way into the aristocracy, and now she would spend decades proving she belonged there. Carnarvon had saved his inheritance, but he had also bound himself to a woman whose origins would always raise eyebrows in certain drawing rooms. They both got what they wanted. Neither got it cleanly. The marriage was not loveless by most accounts. Letters suggest affection. They produced a son and a daughter. But it was also never entirely free of calculation. She brought money. He brought legitimacy. Together, they built something that looked like happiness from a distance. Still, the question hung in the air like smoke from the library fire. What does a castle cost when pride will not bend? For Almina, the price was acceptance, always tinged with doubt. For Carnarvon, it was freedom mortgaged to necessity. For Highclere, it was survival purchased on terms the house would collect for generations. The castle had been saved, but saved for what and at what hidden cost remained to be seen. A heiress with a hidden name. In drawing rooms, everyone admired her poise, but few spoke plainly about where her money came from. Almina Wombwell entered society with two things most women lacked: staggering wealth and a parentage no one would confirm in print. Her official father was Frederick Wombwell, a captain in the Scots Guards. Her mother was Marie Boyer, Wombwell's wife. The record said so. The gossip said otherwise. Alfred de Rothschild moved through Victorian England like a prince. He collected art, hosted legendary parties, and wielded financial influence that made governments nervous. He never married. He had no acknowledged heirs. But he doted on Almina with an intensity that looked like paternity to anyone paying attention. He paid for her education. He introduced her to European society. He bought her a townhouse. When she married Carnarvon, Rothschild settled hundreds of thousands of pounds on her, with more promised in his will. This was not godfather generosity. This was a father securing his daughter's future, the only way Victorian propriety allowed. The silence around her birth was deafening and absolute. No one challenged the Wombwell story. No one needed to. The money spoke louder than any birth certificate. For Almina, this created a peculiar kind of prison. She had access to everything wealth could buy, but she could never fully escape the murmurs that followed her into ballrooms. She was Lady Carnarvon, mistress of one of England's finest estates. She wore tiaras and entertained royalty. But there were women who would never fully accept her, and men who assumed her fortune made her both desirable and slightly suspect. She learned to navigate this world with precision. Her manners were impeccable. Her charity work was visible and genuine. She cultivated friendships with powerful families. She gave Carnarvon an heir, securing the succession. Every move was calculated to transform money into respectability, and slowly, it worked. The renovations at Highclere became her proving ground. Rothschild money rebuilt the interiors. Walls were repapered. Furniture was imported. The castle gleamed. Guests arrived and marveled. Almina played hostess with grace that made her origins fade into the background. Almost. The cost of running Highclere in those years was staggering. A house of that scale required a small army, 50 to 60 servants at any given time. Butler, housekeeper, footmen, maids, cooks, grooms, gardeners, gamekeepers, each had wages, meals, uniforms, and lodging. The kitchen alone consumed hundreds of pounds monthly. Entertaining a single weekend party could cost what a working family earned in a year. Coal for heating, candles and later gas for lighting, laundry, repairs, wine cellars stocked for every occasion. The bills never stopped, and beyond the household, there were the tenants. Farms dotted the estate. Families lived in cottages Carnarvon owned. They paid rent, but they also expected maintenance. A landlord who let his tenants' roofs collapse would lose both income and reputation. Every storm meant inspections. Every hard winter meant repairs. The estate supported hundreds of people, directly and indirectly, and they all looked to the castle for stability. Almina's fortune made this possible. Without Rothschild backing, Highclere would have joined the slow parade of estates falling into ruin or forced sale. With it, the Carnarvons could maintain appearances, entertain lavishly, and pretend the agricultural crisis was someone else's problem. But the pretense had weight. Every dinner party was a performance. Every renovation was a statement. Every season in London required wardrobes and carriages and boxes at the opera. Almina had to be perfect because her origins demanded it. One social misstep, one whisper taken seriously, and the entire facade could crack. She never complained publicly. She never acknowledged the gossip. She simply outworked it. She became indispensable to her husband, to Highclere, to the social machinery that defined their world. She turned money into belonging, one flawless gesture at a time. The question of love in such a marriage remains complicated. Carnarvon's letters to Almina suggest warmth. They shared interests. They traveled together. But love and convenience are not mutually exclusive, and neither are affection and transaction. She needed his name. He needed her money. Whether genuine feeling grew from that foundation or simply coexisted with it, no outsider could say for certain. What is certain is that by 1900, Highclere was restored, the Carnarvon finances were stabilized, and Almina had secured her place. The castle stood as proof that money, carefully deployed, could rewrite history, at least for a while. But survival is not the same as peace, and a fortune can solve immediate problems while creating new hungers. For Carnarvon, stability bred restlessness. For Almina, success bred vigilance. The marriage had saved the castle. Now it had to justify itself, and that would require something more than money. It would require a story worth telling. The Earl who could not sit still. After the crash, his body healed slowly, but his mind learned a new appetite: risk. George Herbert was not built for stillness. Even as a young man, before the title, before the marriage, before the debts, he moved through life with energy that looked like purpose but felt like flight. He raced horses. He sailed yachts. He collected motorized vehicles before most people had seen one. He was an early enthusiast of the automobile, which in the 1890s meant courting death on unpaved roads in machines that barely worked. In 1901, his restlessness nearly killed him. He was driving near Bad Schwalbach in Germany when the car overturned. The crash left him with severe injuries, internal damage, broken bones, weeks in bed, then months of painful recovery. The doctors said he would live, but they warned his health would never be the same. His lungs had been weakened. His constitution was fragile. English winters became dangerous. Damp climates brought coughing fits and fevers. So he did what wealthy invalids had done for generations. He went south. He chased warmth. He became a winter exile, and spending months in Egypt where the dry heat soothed his damaged lungs, and the distance from Hampshire gave him something he had never quite managed at home: space to think. Egypt in the early 1900s was a playground for European aristocrats and a graveyard for ancient kings. The Nile carried steamers full of tourists. Hotels in Cairo and Luxor catered to invalids and adventurers. Archaeologists dug in the sand, funded by wealthy patrons who wanted their names attached to discovery. It was fashionable, romantic, and politically complicated. Britain effectively controlled Egypt, though the fiction of Ottoman sovereignty persisted. The artifacts leaving the ground were supposed to be shared, but in practice, the rules bent toward whoever had money and connections. Carnarvon had both. He began as a tourist, then became a collector, then evolved into something more serious. He wanted to dig. He wanted to find something that mattered. He wanted his name in history books, not just society pages. He hired experts. He obtained permits. He funded excavations in the Valley of the Kings and other sites. Early results were modest, fragments mostly, small tombs already looted in antiquity, pottery shards and broken statues. Nothing that would justify the expense or feed the hunger growing in him. But he was patient in a way he had never been before. The crash had taught him something. Speed kills. Recklessness ends in pain. But careful, sustained risk, backed by money and expertise, could yield rewards that justified the wait. In 1907, he met Howard Carter. Carter was everything Carnarvon was not. Working-class background, self-taught, prickly, obsessive, is brilliant at the technical work of excavation, but terrible at the social graces that open doors. He had been working in Egypt for years, scraping by on small commissions and temporary jobs. He needed a patron. Carnarvon needed someone who could turn money into discovery. The partnership was transactional, but it worked. Carter had the knowledge. Carnarvon had the resources. Together, they would search for something everyone said was impossible: an intact royal tomb in a valley picked over for centuries. Back at Highclere, Almina managed the estate and raised the children. She entertained guests and supervised staff. She watched her husband disappear to Egypt every winter and return every spring, thinner, more distant, and more obsessed. The excavations cost thousands of pounds annually. Permits, labor, equipment, travel, housing for Carter and the crew. It was a gamble that had not yet paid off, but Almina did not object. Perhaps she understood that Carnarvon needed this. The castle was her project. Egypt was his. She had saved Highclere with Rothschild money. He would make their name mean something beyond society columns and debt settlements. By 1914, they had been searching for 7 years. Results remained underwhelming. Then the war came, and everything stopped. Carnarvon returned to England. Carter stayed in Egypt, marking time. The excavations were suspended. Highclere itself transformed. Almina converted the castle into a hospital for wounded soldiers, pouring her energy and Rothschild money into saving men who came back from France, broken and bleeding. She learned nursing. She scrubbed floors. She held hands while men died. The war changed her. It changed everyone. But when it ended in 1918, one thing remained constant. Carnarvon still wanted his tomb. The post-war years brought new pressures. Taxes had risen. Labor costs had increased. The world that had made estates like Highclere possible was fracturing. But Carnarvon convinced Almina to fund one more season, then another, then another. By 1922, they had been searching for 15 years. Carter was convinced the tomb of Tutankhamun was still out there, untouched, waiting. Carnarvon was running out of money and patience. He told Carter this was the final season. After this, no more. Carter returned to the valley in November 1922. Within days, he found stairs descending into bedrock. He sent a telegram to England. Carnarvon booked passage to Egypt immediately. On November 26th, they broke the seal on the inner door. Carter held a candle to the opening and peered inside. Carnarvon asked if he could see anything. Carter replied with words that would echo through history, wonderful things. They had found the tomb, intact, untouched, filled with gold and treasure beyond anything discovered in Egypt before. The boy king who had ruled briefly and died young had been buried with wealth that made even Rothschild money look modest. Carnarvon stood in that dusty corridor, breathing stale air that had been sealed for 3,000 years, and knew his life had just justified itself. The gamble had paid. The obsession had delivered. He was no longer just a rich man who married a fortune. He was the man who found Tutankhamun. Highclere was saved. The legacy was secure. The story would live forever. As he had 4 months left to enjoy it. How gold turned into sand. The castle looked finished, but every polished surface hid an invoice that still needed an answer. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what it cost to be an earl. Not in pride or duty, but in actual pounds and shillings counted at the end of every month. Highclere Castle in the early 20th century was not a home. It was an industry. It employed roughly 60 people year-round. The butler earned perhaps £150 annually. The housekeeper, 100. Footmen, 30 to 50. Maids, 12 to 20. Below stairs, a cook, kitchen maids, scullery workers, laundry staff. Outside, gardeners, grooms, gamekeepers, estate workers. Housing and feeding this workforce cost thousands. Uniforms, coal, candles, oil, soap, food, wages. The household budget alone could reach £8,000 to £10,000 per year, and that was before entertaining. A weekend house party was an exercise in controlled excess. Guests arrived Friday, departed Monday. Each brought servants. The castle had to house, feed, and manage perhaps 20 to 30 people, all expecting standards that matched their rank. Meals were theatrical productions. Breakfast, luncheon, tea, dinner, each with multiple courses served on silver and porcelain. The wine cellar supported this theater with bottles imported from France, stored in conditions that required constant attention. A single weekend could cost £200 or more. The Carnarvons hosted dozens per year. Beyond the household, the estate itself demanded investment. Tenant farms needed repairs. Cottages required maintenance, drainage, fencing, or roads. The land generated income, yes, but it also consumed capital. A bad harvest meant tenants could not pay rent. A hard winter meant emergency repairs. The estate supported perhaps 200 families directly and hundreds more indirectly. Their welfare was the earl's responsibility by custom and by economic necessity. Let the land deteriorate, and the income vanished. Then there were the social obligations. The London season required a townhouse, wardrobes, carriages, opera boxes, dinners, balls. Almina's clothing budget alone could run to thousands annually. Not vanity, but requirement. A countess who appeared in last season's gowns was a countess whose family was failing. Appearances were currency. Spending was investment. Add it together. Household, 8 to 10,000. Entertaining, 3 to 4,000. London season, 2 to 3,000. Estate maintenance, variable but often 5,000 or more. The Carnarvons needed roughly £20,000 per year just to maintain their position without improvement or emergency. Before Almina, Carnarvon lands generated perhaps 12 to 15,000 annually. The gap was what debt looked like. After Almina, Rothschild money filled that gap and allowed for extras, like Egypt. The Egyptian excavations cost £2,000 to £3,000 per season. Permits, equipment, labor. Carter drew a salary. Workers required wages. Supplies shipped from Cairo. Housing for the team. It added up quickly, and it produced nothing for years except hope and pottery shards. This was the moral bargain of aristocratic life. You were born into beauty. You inherited splendor. But you also inherited obligation. To the house, to the tenants, to the family name. Letting Highclere fall meant betraying everyone who depended on it. Selling the estate was unthinkable. So you spent whatever it took to maintain the illusion of permanence. And if you were Carnarvon, you justified the Egyptian expense as investment in legacy. Discovery would bring fame. Fame would bring value. Value would protect the estate when rents failed and taxes rose. It was not entirely wrong. The rich have always bought immortality. Some commission portraits, some endow universities. Carnarvon funded archaeology. When the tomb opened, his calculation proved correct. His name would outlive him. The question was whether he would outlive the discovery. Almina understood this machinery better than most. She had bought her way into it after all. She knew every polished surface hid calculation. Every gracious gesture required funding. She managed the household accounts, negotiated with tradesmen, approved expenses. She was the engine that kept Highclere running while her husband chased glory in the sand. She also understood vulnerability. Her fortune was vast, but not infinite. Rothschild money had limits, even if those limits lay comfortably beyond most people's imagining. Every pound spent on Egypt was a pound not securing the estate. Every season without discovery was another year of gambling on hope. When the telegram arrived in November 1922, it justified 15 years of waiting. The tomb was real. The treasure was intact. Carnarvon had won, but winning in Egypt meant losing something else: control. The discovery became global news within days. Newspapers around the world ran headlines. Tutankhamun, the boy king forgotten for millennia, was suddenly the most famous corpse in history. Every detail of the tomb, every artifact removed, every photograph taken became public property. The Egyptian government wanted ownership. Museums wanted artifacts. Journalists wanted access. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Carnarvon tried to manage it. He sold exclusive rights to the Times of London for £5,000, hoping to control the narrative and fund the excavation. Instead, he infuriated every other publication. Reporters who were shut out became hostile. The Egyptian press accused him of colonialism. The government began questioning his legal right to any artifacts. And then the stories started. Ancient curses, warnings inscribed on tomb walls, dire consequences for those who disturbed the dead. None of it was true. Carter found no curse inscriptions. Egyptian tombs did not work that way. But truth mattered less than drama. A British lord discovering treasure in a colonized land made good copy. A British lord disturbing sacred rest and facing supernatural revenge made legendary copy. The curse narrative was born not in the tomb, but in newsrooms. And once born, it would not die. It fed on coincidence, tragedy, and the public's bottomless appetite for the uncanny. Carnarvon had sought fame. He got it. He had wanted his name remembered. He would be. But not the way he imagined. The castle that had been saved by marriage was about to be defined by death. And Almina, who had spent decades turning money into respectability, was about to watch her husband become a ghost story. Carter's promise. Carnarvon's money. The bargain was simple. One man had the patience, the other had the checkbook, and Egypt had the silence. Howard Carter arrived in Egypt as a teenager in 1891. He came as an artist, hired to draw artifacts for archaeological publications. He had no formal training, no university degree, no family connections. What he had was an eye for detail, a willingness to work in heat that drove others home, and an obsession with the past that matched the desert's indifference to the present. By 1907, when he met Carnarvon, Carter had spent 16 years in Egypt. He had worked for the Egypt Exploration Fund. He had served as Inspector General of Monuments for Upper Egypt. He had also been fired from that position after a confrontation with French tourists, his pride and temper costing him the security he needed. He was scraping by on temporary jobs, painting watercolors for tourists, guiding wealthy visitors through ruins. He was broke, bitter, and brilliant. Carnarvon was rich, restless, and determined to matter. The introduction was made by mutual acquaintances who recognized what both men needed. Within weeks, they had an agreement. Carnarvon would fund excavations. Carter would direct the work. Any discoveries would be shared according to Egyptian law, which theoretically split fines between the excavator and the state, but in practice favored those with political leverage. Their first seasons together were exercises in patience and disappointment. They dug in the Valley of the Kings, the royal burial ground across from Luxor, where pharaohs had been entombed for centuries. But the valley had been picked over since antiquity. Tomb robbers had looted most sites within generations of burial. Archaeologists had been working the area for decades. The consensus was that nothing significant remained. Carter disagreed. He believed one tomb had escaped notice. Tutankhamun, a minor king who ruled briefly around 1300 BC and died young, was known from fragments and references, but had never been found. His tomb had to be somewhere in the valley. Carter was convinced of it. Carnarvon was willing to bet on that conviction. The work was brutal and slow. Crews of Egyptian laborers, sometimes numbering over 100 men, cleared tons of rubble and sand. They worked through winters, the season when heat was bearable. Every stone had to be examined, every depression investigated. Most days produced nothing. Some days produced pieces of pottery or broken statues, tantalizing but not transformative. The costs mounted: labor, equipment, permits, housing, supplies. Carnarvon was spending £2,000 to £3,000 per season on an endeavor that had yet to produce anything worth that investment. Back in England, Almina tracked the expenses. The excavation was funded from her fortune, Rothschild money flowing into Egyptian sand with no immediate return. But Carnarvon kept faith, partly because Carter's conviction was infectious, partly because the search itself had become meaningful. In Egypt, he was not just a wealthy invalid escaping English winters. He was a patron of science, a seeker of history, a man whose money could unlock knowledge that would matter after he died. And there were reasons to believe Carter might be right. Ancient records mention Tutankhamun, in fragments bearing his name, had been found in the valley. If his tomb had been hidden beneath later construction or covered by flood debris, it might have survived intact. In 1914, everything stopped. War in Europe meant no excavations. Carter marked time in Egypt. Carnarvon returned home. Almina converted Highclere into a hospital. The tomb, if it existed, would wait. When digging resumed in 1919, the frustration resumed with it. 3 more seasons, thousands more pounds, rubble and pottery and hope deferred. By 1922, Carnarvon told Carter this was the end, one final season. After that, he would cut funding and turn his attention elsewhere. Carter chose his final search area carefully, a triangle of land near the entrance to another tomb, covered by ancient workers' huts. It was the last unexplored section he believed viable. If Tutankhamun was not there, he was nowhere. On November 4th, 1922, a worker clearing rubble struck stone, steps descending. Carter ordered work stopped. He sent a telegram to England. Carnarvon was at Highclere. The message was brief. Have made wonderful discovery in the valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Await your arrival. Carnarvon sailed immediately. He brought his daughter, Evelyn, with him. They arrived in Luxor on November the 23rd. On the 26th, Carter and Carnarvon broke the seal on the inner door and peered into the antechamber. What they saw justified 15 years. Gold gleamed in the lamplight. Statues, furniture, chariots, boxes, all preserved as they had been left over 3 millennia ago. The tomb had been entered briefly in antiquity, but the robbers had been caught and the tomb resealed. Everything remained. It was the discovery of the century, perhaps of any century. Tutankhamun, a king forgotten by history, suddenly became the most famous pharaoh who ever lived. His name would eclipse Ramses, outlast pyramids, and define how the world imagined ancient Egypt. Carnarvon stood in that tomb and understood he had gambled correctly. His money had purchased immortality. His name would be linked with this discovery forever. Carter would do the work, but Carnarvon was the patron. Without him, the tomb would still be buried. He was elated. He was vindicated. He was also, though he did not know it yet, already in danger. The tomb was a biological hazard. Sealed for thousands of years, it contained dust, mold, bacteria, and fungi that had evolved in isolation. Everyone who entered breathed air that had not circulated in 3,000 years. Their lungs inhaled particles that carried microbes their immune systems had never encountered. Carter and the excavation team would spend years removing artifacts, cataloging thousands of items, documenting everything with painstaking care. Most of them would live long lives. Carter himself survived until 1939, but Carnarvon's health was already fragile. His lungs had been damaged in the car crash 20 years earlier. He was 56, wealthy enough to access the best medical care, but vulnerable in ways that wealth could not fix. He had 4 months, and in those months, the world would transform his death into legend, and Highclere would become inseparable from the story of a curse that may or may not have been real, but would certainly never die. The tomb opens, the world changes. When the seal broke, the air itself seemed to belong to another century, and the newspapers did not miss a breath. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was not just archaeological news. It was a global media event on a scale no excavation had achieved before. The timing was perfect. The world had just emerged from the devastation of the Great War. Millions were dead. Economies were shattered. People wanted wonder, not grief. They wanted stories that suggested history could still astonish. And this story had everything: a lost king, unimaginable treasure, a British lord, and a working-class genius, united in pursuit of the past. Mystery, wealth, now and the thrill of opening what had been sealed when Moses had not yet been born. The Times of London broke the story on November the 30th, 1922, with the exclusive rights Carnarvon had sold them. The headline was restrained, but the implications were vast. Other newspapers, furious at being shut out, scrambled for angles. Reporters descended on Luxor. Photographers bribed their way into restricted areas. The Egyptian government, already sensitive about foreign control of national heritage, began asking hard questions about ownership. Within weeks, the tomb was the most talked about location on Earth. Dispatches from the valley appeared daily. Every artifact photographed became iconic. The golden mask, the nested coffins, the shrines, the chariots. Each was more spectacular than the last. Tutankhamun, who had ruled briefly and died at 19, had been buried with wealth that made contemporary kings look modest. The scale of the discovery was staggering. The tomb contained over 5,000 objects, 3 nested coffins, the innermost solid gold, weighing over 200 pounds, 4 gilded shrines that had to be disassembled to reach the sarcophagus, furniture, clothing, weapons, jewelry, food, wine, everything a king might need in the afterlife, preserved in a space roughly the size of a large apartment. Removing and cataloging it all would take Carter and his team nearly 10 years. Every item had to be photographed in place, documented, carefully extracted, conserved, transported. The work was meticulous, exhausting, and historic. Museums around the world clamored for access. Governments negotiated for artifacts. The discovery had become a political and cultural battleground. But the story the public wanted was not about cataloging or conservation. It was about curses. The curse narrative began almost immediately, though no one can trace it to a single source. Newspapers reported that an inscription on the tomb warned of death for anyone who disturbed the king's rest. No such inscription existed. Carter confirmed this repeatedly, but truth was boring. A warning from beyond the grave sold papers. The legend gained detail with every retelling. Some versions claimed the curse was written on the outer door. Others said it was hidden inside the burial chamber. A few insisted it was inscribed on a statue's base, later removed to prevent panic. None of these claims were verified. All of them spread. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, it gave the story intellectual weight by suggesting publicly that ancient Egyptians might have placed genuine supernatural protections on their tombs. Marie Corelli, a popular novelist, wrote letters claiming she possessed ancient texts warning of dire consequences for tomb raiders. Both had enormous audiences. Both legitimized the idea that something uncanny was at work. And then people started dying. Not immediately, not dramatically. But in the months following the tomb's opening, several people connected to the excavation or the discovery died under circumstances that, individually, were unremarkable, but collectively began to feel ominous. The most significant death, the one that turned whispers into headlines, was Carnarvon's. But before we reach that, we need to understand the ecosystem that made his death feel like confirmation rather than coincidence. The excavation site was not a sterile laboratory. It was a hole in the desert surrounded by laborers, visitors, journalists, government officials, and curiosity seekers. Dozens of people entered the tomb in the first months. Most were exposed to the same dust, mold, and ancient air. Most survived without incident. But the human mind is wired to find patterns, especially when tragedy strikes. When someone dies, we ask why. If multiple people connected by a shared event die, we ask if the connection is causal. The curse narrative offered an answer that was emotionally satisfying, even if it was scientifically baseless. It transformed random deaths into a coherent story. It gave meaning to loss. It also sold newspapers. By early 1923, the tomb coverage had a built-in narrative engine. Every new artifact was a wonder. Every delay was suspicious. Every death was potentially the curse at work. Editors knew what readers wanted. They delivered it. Carnarvon himself seemed unconcerned. He gave interviews. He attended dinners. He basked in the attention. He had spent 15 years and a fortune chasing this discovery. Now the world was watching. He was famous. His name was secured. The castle's legacy was assured. He returned to Cairo in March 1923, planning to oversee the next phase of excavation. He was tired but exhilarated. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had mattered. He had 2 weeks left to live. And what happened in those 2 weeks would turn him from a man into a myth, and Highclere from a castle into a haunted monument. A bite, a blade, a fever. The mosquito bite was small, the razor cut smaller, and together they became the doorway everyone later called a curse. March in Cairo is warm, but not unbearable. The desert heat builds slowly. Evenings are pleasant. Mornings are clear. Carnarvon woke on an ordinary day, prepared to shave, and nicked a mosquito bite on his cheek. A trivial injury, the kind of thing that happens to men who shave every day. He thought nothing of it, but the bite was already infected. Mosquitoes in Egypt carried diseases. Malaria, though, that was not the issue here. More likely, the bite had become contaminated with bacteria from his hands, the water, the towel. When the razor opened it, infection had a path deeper into tissue. Within days, the wound was angry, red, swollen, painful to touch. Carnarvon's doctor examined it and prescribed rest. The infection should clear. It was minor, nothing to worry about. It did not clear. It worsened. The infection spread. His face swelled. Fever developed. His weakened lungs, never fully recovered from the car crash 22 years earlier, began to labor. He developed pneumonia. Pneumonia in 1923 was a killer. Antibiotics did not exist yet. Treatment was supportive. Rest, fluids, hope. If the body could fight the infection, the patient lived. If not, the patient drowned in their own lungs. Carnarvon's body, already compromised, struggled. Almina was in England when the telegram arrived. Her husband was gravely ill. She sailed immediately, bringing their son with her. They reached Cairo on April 2nd. Carnarvon was conscious but declining. The doctors were grim. Pneumonia had taken hold. Blood poisoning was setting in. There was little they could do. Carnarvon died on April 5th, 1923, at 2 a.m. He was 56 years old. The official cause was pneumonia and blood septicemia, secondary to an infected mosquito bite. It was a medical explanation that made perfect sense. Infection, complication, death. But that was not the story the world heard. The story the world heard began with the lights. At the moment of Carnarvon's death, according to reports that appeared in newspapers within days, Cairo experienced a brief citywide power failure. Lights flickered. Some went out entirely. Then they returned. The outage lasted minutes, perhaps less. It was never officially explained. At the same moment, or so the story went, Carnarvon's dog at Highclere let out a howl and collapsed dead. The dog had been healthy. Its death was sudden. Servants found it in the morning. The timing was eerie. Carnarvon died in Cairo at 2 a.m. local time. That was midnight in England. The dog died at midnight. These details spread immediately. The power outage could be verified, sort of. Cairo's electrical system in 1923 was unreliable. Outages happened. This one happening at the exact moment of death was either meaningful or coincidental, depending on what you believed. The dog's death was harder to verify. The story came from Highclere staff. No one doubted they believed it. Whether it happened exactly as described, or whether grief and rumor shaped the memory, is unknowable. But the detail was perfect. Too perfect. It had the narrative weight of an omen. Within days, the curse story exploded. Newspapers around the world ran headlines. Tutankhamun's curse kills Lord Carnarvon. Death strikes tomb discoverer. Ancient Pharaoh's revenge. The stories mixed fact and speculation freely. They quoted Conan Doyle. They referenced Marie Corelli. They listed other deaths connected to the tomb, real or imagined. The truth was more complicated. Carnarvon's death was medically explicable. Infection from a mosquito bite, worsened by shaving, complicated by pre-existing lung damage and pneumonia. Wealthy men in their 50s died of infections all the time in the era before antibiotics. His death was tragic, but not mysterious. The power outage was likely unrelated. Cairo's grid was new and unstable. Outages were common. That one happened near his death was coincidence. Humans notice patterns. We remember the coincidences that feel significant and forget the ones that do not. The dog's death is harder to explain away, but also harder to verify. Dogs die. Old dogs die suddenly. Grief-stricken households remember events through emotional lenses. The detail might be true. It might be embellished. It might be entirely invented. We cannot know. But the curse narrative did not need verification. It needed emotional truth. A wealthy lord had disturbed an ancient king's rest. He had taken treasures that were not his. He had profited from the dead. And he had died in a foreign land, far from home, surrounded by whispers of supernatural revenge. It was a story that confirmed what many people already believed, that wealth does not protect you from fate, that hubris invites punishment, and that some things are better left undisturbed. For Almina, the curse was not legend, it was grief. Her husband was dead. Her children were fatherless. The financial arrangements that had saved Highclere now needed renegotiating. Rothschild money had secured the estate through Carnarvon. Now she had to secure it for the next generation. She brought his body home. The funeral was held at Highclere. He was buried on Beacon Hill, a rise on the estate with views of the castle. Hundreds attended. The world mourned the man who found the tomb. Almina mourned the man she had lived with for nearly 30 years. And the curse, whether real or imagined, had found its first and most famous victim. More deaths would be attributed to it, some legitimate, some absurd. But Carnarvon's death was the cornerstone. The story that made all the others feel possible. Highclere Castle, saved by marriage and made famous by archaeology, was now defined by something else entirely. A curse. A legend. A ghost story that would outlast every artifact Carter removed from that tomb. When the lights went out, the city blackout is the detail people remember, because it sounds like a god clearing his throat. The curse of Tutankhamun did not end with Carnarvon. It metastasized. Over the next 17 years, newspapers and books would link dozens of deaths to the tomb's opening. The counts varied depending on who was counting and what criteria they used. Some lists included only people who entered the tomb. Others included anyone who touched an artifact, attended the opening, or expressed skepticism about the curse. By 1930, some publications claimed over 20 deaths. By 1940, the number had grown to 30 or more. Each new death received coverage. Each was framed as further evidence that disturbing Tutankhamun had consequences. Let us examine the most commonly cited deaths and what we actually know. George J. Gould, an American railroad magnate, visited the tomb in early 1923. He developed a fever shortly after and died in France in May. He was 58. The cause was pneumonia. He had been in poor health for years. His death was tragic, but medically unremarkable. The curse narrative linked it to the tomb visit because the timing was convenient. Arthur Mace, an archaeologist who worked closely with Carter on the excavation, died in 1928. He had been ill for years with pleurisy and arsenic poisoning from preservation chemicals. His death was attributed to his work, but not supernaturally. Arsenic was commonly used in conservation. Prolonged exposure killed many archaeologists and museum workers in that era. The curse story ignored this and framed his death as mysterious. Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's half-brother, died in 1923 of blood poisoning following dental surgery. He was 43. His death had nothing to do with Egypt. He had never visited the tomb, but he was family, and family proximity was enough for the curse narrative to absorb him. Richard Bethel, Carter's personal secretary, was found dead in his London club in 1929. He was 46. The death was ruled natural, possibly heart-related. Some claimed it was suicide. Either way, it fed the curse legend because Bethel had spent years working at the tomb. Edgar Steele, a radiologist who X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy, died in 1926. He was in his 60s. The curse story claimed the pharaoh struck back against the man who photographed his bones. The medical reality was more mundane. Steele was elderly and working with primitive X-ray equipment that exposed him to dangerous radiation levels. His death was likely related to radiation, not curses. And so it went. Death after death, some connected to the excavation, some tangentially related, some completely unrelated, but linked by imaginative journalists. The pattern is clear. People die. Wealthy people who travel to Egypt and work in dusty tombs sometimes die of infections or complications related to their work. But humans crave narrative. Random death is unbearable. Death with meaning, even supernatural meaning, is easier to process. The curse story also ignored all the people who did not die. Howard Carter, who spent more time in the tomb than anyone, lived until 1939. He was 64 when he died, having survived 17 years after the discovery. If the curse was targeting those who disturbed the tomb, why did the chief disturber live a reasonably long life? Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, was one of the first people to enter the burial chamber. She lived until 1980. She died at 78, having outlived her father by 57 years. The curse apparently had patience. Dr. Derry, who performed the autopsy on Tutankhamun's mummy, lived into his 80s. Alfred Lucas, the chemist who worked on conservation, died at 79. Douglas Derry's son, also an Egyptologist who worked on the tomb artifacts, lived a full life. The list of survivors is longer than the list of supposed victims, but survivors do not make headlines. The actual data suggests something unsurprising. People who worked in Egypt in the early 20th century faced health risks: infection, heat exhaustion, contaminated water, tropical diseases. Some died young, most did not. The mortality rate among tomb workers was not statistically unusual for the time and conditions, but statistics do not haunt. Stories do, and the curse story was too good to kill. It persisted because it served purposes beyond entertainment. For Egyptian nationalists, it was a symbolic reclamation. Foreign archaeologists had taken their heritage. The curse was revenge, even if only in narrative. For a world traumatized by war, it was a reminder that some powers transcended guns and empires. And for publishers, it was endless content. Every death could be reframed. Every anniversary could be revisited. The curse also persisted because of confirmation bias. People remembered the deaths that fit the narrative and forgot the survivals that did not. They remembered the power outage and the dog, but ignored the thousands of other outages that happened at non-significant moments. They remembered Arthur Conan Doyle's warning, but forgot that Doyle believed in fairies and seances. They wanted the story to be true, so they interpreted ambiguity as confirmation. For Almina, the curse was white noise. She had real problems. The estate needed managing. Her son was now the 6th Earl and required guidance. Finances needed restructuring. Rothschild money had carried them through Carnarvon's lifetime, but the future was uncertain. Death duties and taxes would consume significant portions of the inheritance. The castle required constant investment. She also had to manage her husband's legacy. The curse narrative was inescapable, but it was also trivializing. Carnarvon had funded one of history's greatest archaeological discoveries. He deserved to be remembered for that, not as a cautionary tale about ancient magic. Almina pushed back where she could, granting interviews that emphasized the science and significance of the find. But the curse had momentum. It fed itself. And Highclere, the castle she had saved with her marriage, was now famous for something beyond its architecture or its history. It was the home of the cursed Earl. Tourists came to see where the man who disturbed Tutankhamun had lived. The castle became a monument to hubris and supernatural justice, whether Almina liked it or not. The lights that went out in Cairo became symbolic. They represented the moment when control was lost. Carnarvon had controlled the excavation. He had controlled the publicity. He had controlled his own story. And then he died, and the story became everyone else's to shape. The lights went out, and when they came back on, his legacy was no longer his own. Almina would spend the rest of her life managing that legacy, trying to separate the man from the myth. She would fail. The myth was stronger. The curse was a better story than the truth. And Highclere, beautiful and expensive and legendary, would carry that curse forward, profiting from it even as it tried to deny it. Almina's war behind the walls. While the world chased pharaohs, she turned Highclere into a hospital and learned what real loss sounds like at night. Before Egypt, before the curse, before Carnarvon's death became global news, there was war. And in that war, Almina Herbert transformed from a society hostess into something far more consequential. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Highclere Castle was at the height of its restored beauty. Almina had spent nearly 20 years perfecting it. Every room gleamed. Every guest was impressed. The estate was a triumph of money applied with taste. It was also about to become a trauma ward. Almina offered Highclere to the War Office as a hospital for wounded officers. The offer was accepted. Within weeks, the transformation began. Ballrooms became wards. Bedrooms became recovery rooms. The castle that had hosted lavish parties now held men with shattered limbs and shell-shocked minds. Almina did not delegate this work. She trained as a nurse. She learned to dress wounds, administer medications, assist in surgeries. She worked long shifts, often through the night. She held hands while men died. She wrote letters to families. She organized supplies, managed staff, and paid for much of it out of her own pocket. The scale was staggering. Highclere treated over 300 patients during the war years. Some recovered and returned to service. Some were discharged as unfit. Some died in rooms where they had once dined on roast pheasant and champagne. Almina saw all of it. She did not flinch. The work changed her. Before the war, she had been a wealthy woman playing the role society assigned. After the war, she understood suffering in ways most aristocrats never would. She had cleaned infected wounds. She had smelled gangrene. She had watched boys her son's age beg for death because the pain was unbearable. That knowledge stayed with her. It also prepared her for what came after. When Carnarvon died in 1923, Almina did not collapse. She grieved, but she acted. She brought his body home. She organized the funeral. She began the legal and financial work of securing the estate for the next generation. She had learned resilience in the wards. She deployed it now. The transition was not simple. Carnarvon's death meant reassessing everything. His will left the estate to their son, the 6th Earl, who was still a young man. Almina retained significant influence and continued to manage household affairs, but the legal ownership had shifted. Rothschild money was still available, but it was no longer automatic. She had to negotiate, justify, and prove the estate's value. The curse narrative complicated this. Highclere was now associated with death and superstition. Some saw that as macabre fascination. Others saw it as taint. Almina worked to reframe the story. She emphasized her husband's contributions to archaeology. She hosted exhibitions of photographs and artifacts from the tomb. She tried to make the discovery the focus, not the death. It worked to a degree. The tomb was genuinely significant. Carter's meticulous work over the next decade produced scholarship that would define Egyptology. Tutankhamun became synonymous with ancient Egypt. Carnarvon's role as patron was acknowledged, even if overshadowed by the curse. But Almina could not control the narrative entirely. The press loved the curse. Every anniversary brought new articles. Every remotely connected death was added to the list. The story had escaped her, just as it had escaped Carter, who spent years angrily denying the curse's existence while journalists ignored him and published more speculation. Almina also faced personal challenges. Her marriage to Carnarvon had been transactional at the start, but it had evolved into partnership. They had built a life together. His death left a void. She eventually remarried, a decision that shocked some in society. Her second husband was Lieutenant Colonel Ian Onslow Dennistoun, a man far less wealthy and prestigious than Carnarvon. The marriage was not happy. They divorced after a few years. Almina was alone again, but wealthier from the settlement. Through all of this, Highclere remained her anchor. She continued to manage it, fund it, and defend it. The castle was her legacy as much as Carnarvon's. She had saved it with her money. She had maintained it through war. She had protected it after his death. It was hers in ways the law would never acknowledge. But the castle also demanded everything. Upkeep costs never decreased. Staff required wages. Repairs were constant. The estate still operated at a loss without Rothschild subsidies. Almina continued to pour money in, believing the investment protected the family name and honored her late husband's memory. She also began to understand something darker. The curse story, as much as she hated it, was valuable. It brought attention. Attention brought visitors. Visitors brought revenue. The castle's association with Tutankhamun made it famous. Famous houses could command higher entry fees, attract more tourists, and justify preservation funding. The curse was a burden, but it was also an asset. Almina never admitted this publicly. She continued to frame Carnarvon as a serious archaeologist and patron. She continued to present Highclere as a noble estate with historic significance. But privately, she understood the economics. Scandal sells. Mystery endures. The castle's future might depend on the very legend she wished to erase. In her later years, Almina remained involved with Highclere, but stepped back from daily management. She lived long enough to see the curse story ossify into permanent legend. She died in 1969 at 93, having outlived her first husband by 46 years. She saw the world change around Highclere. She saw the aristocracy's power erode. She saw estates like hers struggle and fail. But Highclere survived, partly because of the curse, partly because of Almina's relentless financial support, mostly because the story was too good to let die. A wealthy earl married a secret heiress, chased a boy king through the desert, and died in circumstances eerie enough to birth a legend. That story had legs. It could carry a castle through decades of economic strain. Almina understood this, even if she never said it aloud. The war had taught her that survival requires compromise. You do what you must. You use what you have. You turn tragedy into utility. She had turned ballrooms into hospitals. She could live with turning a death into a tourist attraction, as long as it kept the castle standing. The question was whether future generations would be willing to make the same compromises, whether they would embrace the curse or fight it, whether they would see it as burden or opportunity. Almina could not control that. She could only lay the foundation, keep the castle solvent, keep the story alive. Let the next generation decide what to do with the inheritance she had protected at such cost. A curse that paid its rent. Superstition is not just fear, it is a currency, and it spends well when a house needs saving. By the mid-20th century, Highclere Castle faced the same crisis as every great estate in Britain. The world that built these houses was gone. Agricultural rents no longer sustained aristocratic life. Death duties consumed inheritances. Taxes strangled income. Staff costs had risen, while the labor pool willing to serve had vanished. Country houses across England were being demolished, sold, converted, or simply abandoned. Highclere could easily have joined them. It did not, and the curse deserves part of the credit. Tourism saved the British country house. Not immediately, and not universally, but gradually. Estates that could attract paying visitors could generate income independent of land rents. The trick was giving people a reason to visit. Beauty alone was not enough. England had hundreds of beautiful houses. You needed a story. You needed something that made your estate singular. Highclere had its story. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon, Tutankhamun, the curse. It was a narrative with global reach and enduring fascination. Every few years, a new book or documentary would revisit it. Every Halloween, the curse got recycled in articles about famous hauntings. The story refused to die. The castle's connection to Egypt was physical, not just narrative. Carnarvon had brought artifacts back from his excavations within the legal and ethical boundaries of the time. These were displayed at Highclere. Visitors could see actual objects that had been touched by ancient hands, excavated from tombs held by the cursed Earl himself. It was tangible history with an eerie charge. The 6th Earl, Carnarvon's son, understood the value of this. He opened Highclere to tourists in the post-war years, charging admission and guiding visitors through rooms his father had restored with Rothschild money. The Egyptian collection was a centerpiece. People came for the curse and stayed for the architecture. The economics of country house tourism in the late 20th century were challenging but viable. Admission fees, gift shop sales, event hosting, and filming rights could generate hundreds of thousands of pounds annually if managed well. Highclere had natural advantages: proximity to London, stunning architecture, manicured grounds, and a story people wanted to experience in person. By the 1980s and 90s, Highclere was hosting thousands of visitors per year. The numbers fluctuated based on publicity and economic conditions, but the baseline was strong. Admission fees ranged from £5 to £15 per person, depending on what was included. Group tours, special events, and private functions added revenue. The castle was not wealthy, but it was surviving. Then came Downton Abbey. In 2010, when ITV premiered a period drama about an aristocratic family navigating social change in the early 20th century. The show was filmed at Highclere. The castle became Downton Abbey, the fictional estate at the heart of the story. The show was a global phenomenon. Millions watched weekly. The finale drew over 9 million viewers in the UK alone. International audiences were even larger. Overnight, Highclere became one of the most recognizable houses in the world. Visitor numbers exploded. The estate now attracts over 150,000 visitors annually during open seasons. Admission prices increased to £20 to £25 per person. Special Downton-themed tours command premium rates. The gift shop sells branded merchandise. Weddings and corporate events book years in advance at rates that would make the fifth Earl weep with relief. The financial transformation was profound. Highclere went from struggling to solvent, from anxiety to planning. The current Earl, the eighth, has used the revenue to fund long-deferred restoration work. Roofs have been repaired, stonework restored, the gardens replanted, staff expanded. The castle that Almina saved with marriage money is now sustained by television royalties and tourist pounds. But the curse remains part of the package. Visitors come for Downton, but they stay curious about Carnarvon. The Egyptian collection is still displayed. The story is still told. Guides reference the tomb, the discovery, the death. The curse is mentioned with a knowing smile. Never confirmed, never denied. It is atmospheric seasoning on the Downton main course. The irony is delicious. A story rooted in colonial archaeology, superstition, and early 20th century media sensationalism now funds the preservation of a castle built on Victorian industrial wealth and maintained by a fictional television aristocracy. The layers of narrative are almost too perfect. Highclere is a monument to the power of story itself. The house survives because people want to visit the place where the cursed Earl lived and where Downton Abbey was filmed. History and fiction blur. Both pay the bills. The preservation costs are still enormous. Maintaining a house of Highclere's scale requires roughly £1 million per year. Roofing, stonework, plumbing, heating, electrical systems, groundskeeping, staff salaries, insurance, security. The list is endless. Tourism revenue covers much of this, but not all. The Earl supplements with private events, filming contracts, and careful financial management. The castle also benefits from grants and heritage funding, available to properties of historic significance that open to the public. But these grants require compliance with preservation standards, public access commitments, and bureaucratic oversight. The Earl cannot simply run Highclere as a private estate. It is a public trust, legally and practically. The price of survival is accessibility. This creates tension. The family still lives at Highclere. They occupy private quarters while tourists walk through state rooms. They balance privacy with the economic necessity of opening their home to strangers. It is a compromise Almina would recognize. You do what survival requires. And survival requires the curse. Not literally, not as belief, but as narrative fuel. The curse keeps Highclere in the cultural conversation. It links the castle to one of the most famous archaeological discoveries ever made. It gives the house a shadow, an edge, a hint of the uncanny that makes it more than just another pretty building. Would tourists still come without the curse? Probably. Downton Abbey is a powerful draw. The architecture is stunning. The grounds are beautiful. But the curse adds depth. It connects visitors to a specific moment in history when the world was fascinated by ancient Egypt and terrified by the idea that disturbing the dead had consequences. The castle's gift shop sells books about the curse, postcards featuring Carnarvon and Tutankhamun, replicas of Egyptian artifacts. The merchandise is tasteful but unambiguous. This house is where the cursed Earl lived. This is where he dreamed of Egypt and funded the search that killed him. Come see where the story began. It works. People buy the books. They take the tours. They stand in the library where Carnarvon planned his expeditions and wonder if something ancient really did reach across time to punish him. The ambiguity is part of the appeal. The castle never confirms the curse. It just lets the question linger. Superstition, as it turns out, is excellent business. It costs nothing to maintain and generates endless interest. A rational explanation for Carnarvon's death is historically accurate, but dramatically inert. An ancient curse is historically dubious, but narratively irresistible. Highclere offers both and lets visitors choose which they believe. The result is a castle that thrives on the very legend its original residents might have found humiliating. Almina fought the curse narrative. The current Earl profits from it. Both were doing what the moment required. Survival is not about purity. It is about adaptation. Highclere adapted. It turned scandal into tourism, superstition into revenue, and a tragic death into an immortal story. The castle endures because the curse endures. One pays for the other. And as long as people are fascinated by ancient Egypt, aristocratic excess, and the possibility that some things cannot be explained, Highclere will have visitors willing to pay for a glimpse of where it all happened. Downton's glow, Highclere's shadow. People arrive looking for romance, then notice how every grand room also feels like a stage built over secrets. In Downton Abbey gave Highclere a second act. The show premiered in 2010, exactly 87 years after Carnarvon's death. The timing was unintentional but perfect. The world was emerging from financial crisis, hungry for comfort and escapism. Downton offered both. Gorgeous costumes, intricate plots, a cast of characters navigating social change with wit and grace. It was historical fantasy, lushly produced and emotionally satisfying. And it was filmed at Highclere. The castle became Downton Abbey. The exterior shots, the grand staircase, the library, the dining room, all Highclere. Millions of viewers watched without knowing they were seeing a real house with a real history far stranger than any the show invented. Downton was fiction, Highclere was legend. The show's success transformed the estate's finances and reputation. As before Downton, Highclere was a niche destination for Egyptology enthusiasts and country house tourists. After Downton, it became a pilgrimage site. Fans traveled from around the world to see where the Crawley family lived, loved, and schemed. They wanted to walk the same halls, climb the same stairs, imagine themselves into the world the show created. The estate responded with strategic precision. Downton-themed tours, afternoon teas, special exhibitions featuring costumes and props from the show. The gift shop expanded to sell Downton-branded merchandise alongside Egyptian artifacts and Carnarvon biographies. The castle became layered. One visit could encompass 3 narratives: the architectural history, the curse legend, and the television phenomenon. Visitor reviews reveal the tension, and some come for Downton and are surprised by the curse. Others come for the curse and are annoyed by Downton's dominance. A few come for the architecture and are overwhelmed by both. The castle tries to serve all audiences, but the balance is delicate. The truth is, Downton softened Highclere's image. The curse story is dark. It involves death, colonial exploitation, and the uncomfortable question of whether stealing from tombs invites supernatural justice. That is not family-friendly content. It is fascinating but morbid. Downton, by contrast, is romantic. It is about resilience, family loyalty, and elegance under pressure. It makes Highclere feel warm and inviting. The show's global popularity brought demographics to the estate who might never have considered visiting a house associated with ancient curses and aristocratic tragedy. But the shadow remains. You cannot walk through Highclere without encountering Carnarvon. His portrait hangs in the castle. His Egyptian collection is displayed with reverence and explanation. The guides mention the tomb. The brochures reference the discovery. Downton can distract, but it cannot erase. This creates an interesting dynamic. Downton fans come expecting romance and find themselves confronted with colonialism. Curse enthusiasts come expecting mystery and find themselves surrounded by Downton merchandise. The castle is trying to be 2 things at once, and mostly succeeding, but the effort shows. The current Earl, George Herbert, the 8th to hold the title, manages this tension with pragmatism. He understands that Highclere's survival depends on broad appeal. Downton brought millions. The curse keeps them curious. The architecture justifies the visit. Together, they create a package that generates enough revenue to sustain a house that costs over £1 million annually to maintain. But there is something unsettling about the performance. Highclere is a stage. It has always been a stage. Almina staged dinners to prove she belonged. Carnarvon staged himself as a serious patron of archaeology. The current Earl stages Downton experiences for paying guests. The house is endlessly performing, and the performance is always about masking cost with beauty. Every grand room at Highclere hides infrastructure. Behind the paneling, modern heating and electrical systems. Beneath the floorboards, plumbing installed decades ago and requiring constant maintenance. The roof leaks, the stonework crumbles, the gardens demand endless labor. The beautiful surfaces conceal relentless decay that only money can slow, not stop. This is true of every historic house, but Highclere makes the contradiction visible. You tour rooms where television aristocrats pretended to live, in a house where real aristocrats actually struggled, funded by a woman whose origins were whispered about, married to a man who died chasing immortality and found it in the form of a curse. The layers are dizzying. The castle also benefits from timing. Downton aired as Britain was reassessing its relationship with aristocracy and empire. The show was nostalgic, but not uncritical. It acknowledged class tensions, gender inequality, and social change. It let viewers enjoy the beauty while recognizing the system that produced it was deeply flawed. Highclere occupies a similar space. Visitors can admire the architecture while acknowledging the wealth that built it came from sources both legitimate and questionable. They can enjoy the Downton fantasy while learning about the curse, which is itself a story about colonial archaeology and its consequences. The castle does not hide its contradictions, it displays them. This honesty, or at least the appearance of honesty, is part of the appeal. Highclere is not pretending to be a museum of aristocratic perfection. It is a working estate inhabited by descendants of the people whose decisions shaped it, trying to preserve something beautiful and complicated. The current Earl is not performing nobility. He is performing stewardship. It is a subtler role, but more credible. The challenge going forward is sustainability. Downton's cultural dominance will fade. Already, years have passed since the show ended, though the films have extended its relevance. Eventually, new generations will visit Highclere without Downton nostalgia. They will need other reasons to come. The curse is evergreen. As long as people are fascinated by ancient Egypt, Carnarvon's story will resonate. The castle's connection to Tutankhamun is permanent. Every major Egyptology exhibition, every documentary about the tomb, every book about the discovery mentions Highclere. The association is indelible, but the curse alone might not be enough. Highclere needs to remain culturally relevant, and that requires adaptation. New exhibitions, new partnerships, new stories. The house has survived by evolving. Almina turned it into a hospital. The 6th Earl turned it into a tourist destination. The current Earl turned it into Downton Abbey. The next generation will need to find their own angle. What seems certain is that Highclere will continue to be a place where beauty and cost, romance and calculation, history and performance coexist. The castle is not a relic. It is a living monument to the compromises required to sustain beauty in a world that no longer supports it automatically. It is gorgeous. It is exhausting. It is expensive. And it is absolutely determined to survive. What the Pharaoh never took. In the end, the curse is less a verdict than a mirror, reflecting whatever the living cannot bear to admit. Stand at Beacon Hill, where Carnarvon is buried, and look down at Highclere. The castle rises from manicured lawns, its towers catching light, its windows reflecting sky. It looks eternal, it looks inevitable, and it looks like something that has always existed and always will. None of that is true. Highclere is a Victorian invention, built on medieval foundations, redesigned by architects hired by ambitious aristocrats who wanted their homes to look like fairy tales. The castle is barely older than the idea of the weekend house party. It is younger than the railway. It is a stage set for a world that lasted perhaps 70 years before collapsing under its own contradictions. But it endures. And the reason it endures is because people like Almina were willing to do whatever survival required. Marry for money, fund obsessions, turn tragedy into narrative, compromise, calculate, and never stop performing. The curse story is part of that performance. It is Highclere's most durable asset because it transforms a simple archaeological discovery into a myth about power, hubris, and the limits of control. Carnarvon could buy excavations. He could fund Carter. He could open tombs and claim treasures. But he could not control what happened next. Not the publicity, not the narrative, not his own death. The curse gives his death meaning. Without it, he is just another wealthy man who died of an infection while traveling. With it, he becomes a cautionary tale, a symbol, a warning. The story suggests that some things are sacred and violating them has consequences. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The curse did not destroy Highclere, it saved it. If Carnarvon had died quietly at home, his legacy would be minor. A footnote in Egyptology. a patron who funded important work but was overshadowed by the archaeologist who did the digging. Almina would still have saved the castle with her fortune, but the house would lack the narrative magnetism that makes it singular. The curse made Highclere famous. It linked the castle to one of the 20th century's defining archaeological moments. It gave the estate a story that could be told and retold, monetized and mythologized. Without the curse, there is no tourist industry. Without tourists, there is no revenue. Without revenue, the castle likely falls into the same decline that claimed hundreds of other estates. So did something ancient reach across time to punish Carnarvon? Or did grief, coincidence, and a sensationalist press create a ghost powerful enough to haunt a castle for a century? Both can be true, or neither. The beauty of the curse is that it exists in the space where proof is impossible. You can believe in supernatural justice or medical misfortune. You can see patterns or randomness. The story accommodates both readings. What the curse absolutely did, regardless of its metaphysical reality, was give Highclere a legacy that money alone could never purchase. Almina bought survival, Carnarvon bought immortality, the castle got both. The philosophical question remains, was it worth it? For Almina, the cost was a lifetime of managing appearances, defending a husband's reputation, and turning private grief into public narrative. She saved Highclere, but could never fully own it. Society accepted her money, but whispered about her origins. She was powerful and perpetually insecure. For Carnarvon, the cost was his life. He got what he wanted. His name is remembered. His discovery matters. But he did not live to enjoy it. He died far from home, feverish and in pain, leaving his family to manage a legacy he could not control. For Highclere, the cost is ongoing. The castle must perform constantly. It must welcome strangers into rooms that were meant to be private. It must commodify its history, package its tragedy, and sell tickets to people who want to touch the edges of a story that is both true and invented. But the house endures. And in a world where so many great estates have been demolished, abandoned, or converted into apartments, endurance is its own kind of victory. The curse, real or imagined, is less about the Pharaoh than about us. It is about what we believe, what we fear, and what we need from our stories. We want to believe that wealth does not protect you from fate. We want to believe that hubris invites punishment. We want to believe that some things are sacred and should not be touched. Tutankhamun's tomb was not sacred. It was a burial, a very rich one, but functionally the same as any grave. The boy king was not a god. He was a teenager who ruled briefly and died young. The treasures were not cursed. They were objects, beautiful and historically significant, but not magical. And yet, the story persists because it serves a purpose. It lets us believe that money is not omnipotent, that power has limits, that the universe occasionally delivers justice, even if we have to invent the mechanism. Highclere understands this. The castle does not confirm the curse. It does not need to. It simply displays the artifacts, tells the story, and lets visitors wonder. The ambiguity is the point. The mystery is the product. And as long as people are willing to pay for a glimpse of that mystery, the castle will survive. So what did the Pharaoh never take? Highclere, the house Carnarvon saved, the legacy Almina protected, the story that became more valuable than any artifact removed from the tomb. The curse could not destroy it because the curse became part of its foundation. The very legend that was supposed to be punishment became the castle's salvation. Wealth bought beauty. Obsession bought discovery. Death bought immortality, and the castle, built on all three, stands as proof that survival is not about purity or righteousness. It is about adaptation. It is about using every tool available, even tragedy, even scandal, even a curse that may or may not be real. In the end, Highclere is not a cautionary tale. It is a success story, a testament to what can be preserved when people are willing to compromise, calculate, and perform. The castle glows in the Hampshire sun, filled with tourists taking photographs and buying souvenirs. And somewhere in that glow, Almina's ghost is probably nodding. She saved this place. She did what survival required. And 100 years later, the castle still stands. The pharaoh never took that.